your host for Wealth Protector TV. Thanks for jumping on, and really excited to be sitting down with Brian Chou today, who is an expert attorney, asset protection, estate planning, business planning with Barth Calderon. And Brian's going to break down estate planning and the new stuff that's going on, new taxes that are on the table, and why it's important to take control of your planning right now. A lot of stuff going on. So let's go join Brian, and thanks for coming on board. Hi, everybody. This is Paul Hitchcock, and thank you for jumping on Wealth Protector TV. Very excited to have my colleague here, Brian Chou, with us today, who is a top asset protection, estate planning, and business planning attorney with Barth Calderon. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, Paul. Happy to hear. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I want to jump right into this. We're talking about estate taxes, Brian, some new stuff going on, and you're going to give us a little bit of background on that, and let's get in.
Sure. So one important thing that you may or may not be aware about is that something out there called the estate tax, which is a tax that the government places on your assets when you die. And this is a tax beyond all the other taxes that you pay during the course of your lifetime, right? Income tax, capital gains, property taxes, you name it, right? On your way out the door, the government has another bite at the apple. And so this is something that's very important for you to know about as a client or a prospective client. Because that can result in significant taxes that are paid by your estate after you die and pass them on to your loved ones. And
Brian,
so,
how do you define an estate? Like when you say estate, do you got to be like a millionaire for that to be an issue?
So your estate is, it sounds fancy, but what your estate is it's everything that you accumulate during the course of your lifetime. So your house, your bank accounts, your investment accounts, your business, life insurance policies, 401ks, right? Those are all comprise your estate. So whether you have very modest assets or whether you have several millions of dollars of assets, you have an estate.
Got it.
Yep. And so the idea here is we want to be aware of this tax, because if we have significant tax liability, there are things that we can do to protect more of our assets from the government so we can pass more of those assets on to our loved ones without being subject to this tax. So the way that the estate tax works is this, right? So the government says that when you die, we're going to figure out the value of everything that you own. So we're going to gather up everything you've got, and we're going to come up with a value or a number as to what your estate is worth. And so that number that you're passing on to your loved ones is then subject to the estate tax. The bad news is the rate is pretty significant, right? So the current rate is 40%. The good news, however, is the government also allows you an exemption amount. So there's a certain amount that you can pass on to your loved ones before this tax applies. The current amount that you can protect from estate taxes is also is historically high. So it's currently $11.7 million per spouse. So if you're a married couple, you can pass on a little over $23 million to your loved ones without being subject to this tax. If, and this is an important if, right? If you pass away with the current laws in place.
Okay.
So the point to be taken there, right, is because most people, their assets don't rise into the tens of millions of dollars. And so they may be thinking, hey, this is something that is for the ultra wealthy. This is not something that really applies to me and my family, but not so fast. And the reason why is because these laws change over time. And so the estate tax is a classic political football. So it will ebb and flow with the changing of administrations, right? And so when we have a Republican Congress and a Republican president, right, what they tend to want to do is they want to raise the exemption amount. So they want to increase the amount that you can protect, and they want to decrease the tax rate, right? When we have a Democratic legislature in place, what they want to do is they want to shrink the amount that you can protect, and they want to raise the tax rate.
So
Make sense?
I'm guessing that's going on right now.
Right. So that's what's going on right now. So if you guys have been paying attention to the news these last couple months, right, we now have a Democratic president and we now have a Democratic legislature. And we do expect that there will be new tax legislation, most likely sometime this year, that will significantly change the estate tax rules. And so, so to give you a little bit of context, the Democratic, right, the current exemption is $11.7 million per spouse. The Democratic proposal, right, essentially what they'd like to do is they'd like to reduce the estate tax exemption down to $3.5 million per spouse. So that's a
Can I ask you a quick question on that?
Sure.
So when they come in and audit, like you mentioned, and you're saying, okay, you could be impacted by this depending on the value of your estate. If you got a house that's worth a couple $1 million, are they taking the full value of the house, or are they taking out the mortgage on it for the audit purposes to determine this stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. So it's going to be based on the net value of the property. So they do account for debt, right? So if you have a $2 million house and $1 million mortgage, and that's the only asset that you have, then the number that we're working with is $1 million for estate tax purposes.
Okay, so the gross value of your estate for the audit does not include the debt.
Right, or the number that they're going to utilize in calculating your estate will account for or net out any debt that you have.
Got it. Okay,
yeah.
Got it.
So,
all right.
So the idea, right? So the Democrats in an ideal world would like to lower the amount to $3.5 million per spouse. Whether or not that will happen, there's a lot that needs to play out before that happens, right? It's not yet a foregone conclusion because there are very slim Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, and so they're going to have to appeal to moderates in order to get this legislation passed.
Right.
But it is something that's important to keep an eye on, because if these exemptions drop, and there's a good, I would say chances are very good that the exemption is going to shrink significantly. And if I were a betting man, I'd say where we will end up is somewhere between $3.5 million per spouse and let's say $5.5 million per spouse, right? So at least they're going to get cut in half. And so, so if you're a business owner or you're a real estate investor and you've accumulated significant assets, that's going to be something that's important for you to keep an eye on and important for you to have on your radar to start planning, because the earlier you start planning, the more we can do to protect your assets, right? If you're trying to transfer everything or plan for everything on your deathbed, it's a lot harder for us to protect those assets from estate taxes. Where if we start early and when you have a couple decades of planning ahead of us, then we can kind of set everything up right so that we can pass a lot of these assets on to our loved ones. Another point that I want to hammer home here for the audience is you may think, hey, the current, even if the exemptions go down to $3.5 million per spouse, right? That means we can protect $7 million of assets, if we die with those laws in place. My assets are only worth $4 million right now. I don't have to worry about that because I'm under that 7 million. But the important thing is not just where you are relative to the exemption amount. It's really where will your estate be relative to the exemption amount when you or your spouse passes away, right? Okay. And so if you're worth $4 million and you're 85 and in poor health and you're, let's say, unmarried, right? We don't have that big of a concern because the likelihood that you're going to exceed, your estate will exceed your protection is not as high, right? And so whereas let's say that you're worth $4 million and
it's property,
you're in your 40s,
and stocks, yeah, and it's growing.
And you're in good health and you have an investment mindset and you're wise with your money, right? You can see where that money could easily be worth 15, 20, $30 million, 3 or 4 decades down the line. And so So that's what we have to be mindful of when we're planning for this stuff.
Do you go through this with clients, the future projections, when you're talking to them about estate planning? You kind of look ahead, and it's kind of a comprehensive look at things like that?
Yes. So, I mean, that's the mindset in which we're looking at things, because, Wayne Gretzky had, the famous hockey player, he had a quote.
Yeah.
He attributed his success to, hey, I go where the puck is going, not where the puck is. And that's the same mindset that we're looking at with our clients, is we want to figure out where you're going to go, not where you are currently at this particular point in time.
So there's a lot of stuff changing right now, it sounds like. There's stuff on the table with the new administration. What is your recommendation? I mean, people just, kind of get a tune-up here and take a look at things. And if you have estate planning, what's old estate planning? Let's say they did it 7 years ago, 10 years ago. Is that old in your mind?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if I would want to cast that sort of judgment and say that something is, that something is old or outdated without looking at the documents. But I would say that if something was done 7 to 10 years ago or beyond, right, we have some clients, I've come across some clients that have some dusty old estate documents out there. But that being said, I'd say, if you've, generally speaking, we advise our clients, it's good every, 2 to 3 years to come in and look things over, right? If you don't have a major life event, right? Obviously, if something crazy happens, somebody passes away, somebody's born, you start a new business or you sell a business, you acquire more real estate, right? Then those are obviously great times to come in and kind of look things over and to make sure everything's kind of going according to plan. But I'd say if everything, all is quiet on the Western Front and it seems like nothing major has happened, I'd say for, kind of your normal everyday, middle class family, every 2 to 3 years is a reasonable time to just look things over and just make sure that everything still kind of is going along with what you intended. Because whether it feels like it or not, we do evolve as people, and our personal situations and our financial situations will change. And then if you layer on top of that the fact that the laws are constantly changing, it's a good idea to look things over. So to answer your question, for those people that have had trusts done 7, 10, 15 years ago, I'd say it definitely warrants us taking a look and seeing what those assets, what everything says, and layer on top of that how their situation has changed over that time. Whether or not there would be actually anything that needs to be done would really just be determined on what we find. Right.
And for those that have nothing in place, no will, no trust, the kind of big bad probate scenario, court stepping in, is a reality, right? If they haven't done anything.
Yeah, so that's an important point, Paul, and thank you for bringing that up, which is the estate tax is just one component to estate planning, right? So a lot of times people think, hey, my assets, I don't have several millions of dollars. What do I need to do any estate planning for? But even if you don't have, several millions of dollars, you still have, right? If you've accumulated some level of assets, it's important to make sure that you have basic planning in place so that the right people can step in and make your decisions in the event of your death or incapacity, right? Whether it be your personal decisions, whether it be your financial decisions, whether it be your medical decisions. And also we want to make sure that these assets can be, that your loved ones can take over easily without having to go to court. And that's kind of what you were saying before with probate, right? So if you own assets in your own name and all of a sudden you're gone, right, you're not around anymore to make those decisions. And so nobody else can step in and do anything with those assets either. So, right, those assets, there's no one around to sell the assets or to rent out your property or to live in the property, for example. And so at that point, it falls to the state to then determine what to do with those assets, and we have to go to court. And when you go to court, things typically become much more expensive, much more time consuming, and it's all public. So those are three big reasons why people really, really don't like probate, right? Going to probate court. And so we want to make sure that that stuff is all properly planned out, not just for the avoidance of probate, but also, right, to make sure that your assets set your family up for future success, right? If you have minor children, we may not want them running around with a bunch of money when they're 18, right? We may not want to expose those assets to their spouse if they're going through a divorce. We may want to right? We may want to make sure that those assets are properly invested and creating a legacy for future generations to come. And so, so those are all things that are oftentimes overlooked when people make those, right? When people think about estate planning, and that's why it's important to kind of talk through those things so that they can know what they don't know, right? And because a lot of times they say, hey, I'm leaving everything to my kids equally. Okay, fine, but how do we do that? How do we do that in a way that makes sense so that, we don't turn the kids into their own worst enemies, and we want to set them up again for future success, not to set them up for a position where they've maybe wasted a bunch of assets or managed it irresponsibly. So.
Right. Brian, always great information. And I think it's a good reminder about what the importance of estate planning. So thanks as always, and really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for jumping on. We'll see you next time.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
All right.